What if most of your decisions, thoughts, and desires weren't truly yours? Picture this. You wake up, scroll through social media, feel anger at a headline, make an unplanned purchase, and choose clothes based on others' opinions. By evening, you made hundreds of choices. You feel free. But what if you're not? What if you're a marionette in an elaborate puppet show, dancing to strings you can't see? This isn't mystical theory. This is the disturbing reality Carl Jung dedicated his life to uncovering. Jung believed that beneath conscious awareness lies a vast dark ocean of unconscious forces shaping every aspect of behavior. While we tell ourselves stories about rational choice and free will, hidden psychological mechanisms quietly write the script of our lives. Why do you crave products after seeing ads? Why do you repeat relationship patterns you swore you'd never repeat? Why do entire societies move in waves of collective madness? The answer lies in what Jung called the architecture of the unconscious mind, a complex system of psychological forces operating like a shadow government behind the conscious mind. These aren't abstract concepts. These are active, living forces shaping your world right now. Throughout history, those who understood these mechanisms wielded immense power. Propagandists used them to start wars. Advertisers created desires you never knew you had. Politicians won elections. Cult leaders captured minds. Most terrifyingly, these forces work best when targets remain completely unaware. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 7 powerful psychological signs that secretly control human behavior. These aren't theoretical concepts. They're dark, psychological realities embedded in society, operating through propaganda, relationships, social media, and modern life itself. You'll never look at your choices the same way. You'll see the invisible strings pulling at your thoughts and actions. Most importantly, you'll understand why Jung believed recognizing these forces is the first step toward genuine psychological freedom. But I warn you, once you see these patterns, you cannot unsee them. Reality will never look quite the same. Are you ready to discover what's really controlling your behavior? To understand how we're controlled, we must confront the most uncomfortable truth about human nature. The part of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge exists. Jung called this the shadow. Everything you've decided you're not. Every dark impulse buried, every shameful thought suppressed, every aspect of human nature you've convinced yourself you've transcended. The rage you swallow at work, envy toward successful friends, sexual desires you pretend don't exist, cruelty you're capable of but dare never express. Here's what makes the shadow terrifying. The more violently you deny these aspects, the more powerfully they control you from the unconscious. Consider the politician crusading against corruption while secretly accepting bribes. The religious leader is preaching purity while engaging in behaviors he condemns. The social media activist championing tolerance while privately harboring deep prejudices. These aren't just hypocrites. They're living examples of shadow operation. When we refuse to acknowledge dark impulses, they don't disappear. They grow stronger in denial's darkness, eventually erupting in ways that destroy the very image we've worked to maintain. But the shadow's influence extends beyond individual hypocrisy through psychological projection. When we can't face our darkness, we project it onto others. Look at moral panics throughout history. The Salem witch trials weren't about witches. They were a community projecting collective sexual repression onto vulnerable women. The McCarthy era wasn't about communists, Americans projecting authoritarian impulses onto foreign ideology. Today, cancel culture, political hysteria, social media mob justice, all manifestations of collective shadow projection. We are so uncomfortable with our capacity for cruelty and irrationality that we desperately seek to destroy these qualities in others. The most chilling aspect, shadow projection feels righteous. When attacking someone else's darkness, you feel morally superior, justified, pure. But Jung understood that this righteousness is often the clearest sign you're being controlled by your own shadow. Your shadow knows you better than you know yourself, containing all parts you refuse to examine. What you refuse to examine inevitably examines you, shaping choices, relationships, worldview, and destiny in ways you never intended. From the shadow's darkness, we enter an even more vast realm of control, ancient patterns programming. Human behavior for millennia. Jung discovered that buried in our collective unconscious lie archetypes, universal behavioral patterns transcending individual psychology. These aren't interesting concepts. They're invisible scripts writing your life story. Think of archetypes as psychological software installed in human operating systems thousands of years ago. The hero's journey, the nurturing mother, the wise old man, the seductive temptress. These patterns were carved into our psyche through generations of experience, continuing to run in the background of every decision. But these ancient programs are being deliberately exploited by modern power structures. Every movie, advertisement, and political campaign is constructed around archetypal patterns. Hollywood doesn't just entertain, it activates archetypal responses, bypassing the rational mind entirely. Superhero movies don't just entertain, they program you with the hero archetype, creating unconscious desires for mission, enemy, world to save. Politicians embody archetypes, the strong father protecting the nation, the wise mother nurturing society, the rebel hero fighting corruption. Voters don't choose based on logic, they choose the archetype resonating with unconscious. Needs.corporate marketing turned archetypal manipulation into science. Nike doesn't sell shoes, they sell the hero archetype. Just Do It directly activates hero's call to adventure. Apple doesn't sell technology, they sell the magician archetype, promising transformation through mysterious technological power. Most insidious, these patterns shape personal identity without awareness. You unconsciously select an archetypal role and spend your life acting it out. Are you the hero, constantly seeking challenges? The caregiver, compulsively sacrificing for others? The rebel, defining yourself through opposition? The innocent, avoiding complexity? The sage, believing knowledge alone saves you? Whatever archetypal pattern dominates becomes a prison of predictable behavior. The hero creates unnecessary conflicts. The caregiver enables destructive behavior. The rebel becomes what they fight. The innocent remains vulnerable. The sage becomes paralyzed by analysis. You probably didn't choose your dominant archetype. It chose you through childhood experiences, cultural conditioning, unconscious identification. True psychological freedom requires recognizing which archetypal patterns operate in your life and relating to them consciously, rather than being unconsciously controlled. We now encounter perhaps psychology's most chilling discovery, our species' terrifying capacity for obedience to authority, even when leading to moral atrocity. Milgram's 1960s experiments revealed something disturbing. Ordinary people, teachers, engineers, postal workers, instructed by lab-coat authority figures, administered what they believed were increasingly painful electric shocks to victims. Despite screams, despite pleas for mercy, despite moral reservations, 65% continued obeying what they believed was a lethal shock level. These weren't sadists. They were normal people, taught to respect authority, follow instructions, and trust experts. That conditioning overrode basic moral instincts. Jung understood this wasn't a bug in human psychology, it was a feature. For millennia, survival depended on following tribal leaders, respecting hierarchies and conforming to group decisions. But this mechanism that once protected us now makes us vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation. Modern authoritarian systems don't tell you what to think, they construct the framework within which thinking occurs. They don't eliminate options, they curate which options you're allowed to consider. You believe you're freely choosing political opinions, but they were shaped by media presenting itself as authoritative. You believe you're making independent medical decisions, but they're influenced by experts whose credentials intimidate compliance. You believe you're choosing career paths, but those paths were determined by systems presenting certain choices as viable while making others invisible. Modern authority-based control makes you complicit in your own manipulation. You don't feel oppressed, you feel informed. You don't feel controlled, you feel guided. The genius. Even rebellion often reinforces the authority it opposes. When your identity is defined by what you're against, you're still allowing external authority to determine your psychological framework. Rebel and conformist are both controlled by the same authority, just playing different roles. Corporate environments exploit authority-based psychology through hierarchy as a control mechanism. Educational systems condition students to value external validation over internal understanding, seeking right answers rather than developing independent thought capacity. Media constructs expert consensus manipulation. You're not told what to think directly. You're presented with credentialed authorities who happen to agree. The message: smart, educated, responsible people think this way. Disagree and you're ignorant, uneducated, irresponsible. Breaking free requires developing genuine psychological autonomy, learning to trust your perception, develop your values, and take responsibility for choices rather than seeking external validation. But most find genuine autonomy terrifying. Following instructions is easier than thinking independently. Letting others decide is more comfortable than bearing personal responsibility. Beyond individual psychology and authority structures, we confront Jung's most profound discovery. Individual consciousness might be an illusion, and we're connected through an invisible psychological network influencing behavior on a massive scale. Jung called this the collective unconscious, a shared psychological substrate connecting all human minds deeper than personal awareness. This explains why identical ideas emerge across cultures never in contact, why mass movements sweep populations like psychological epidemics, and why you sometimes feel and act in ways seeming to come from outside individual consciousness. Stock market crashes aren't just economic events. They're psychological contagions spreading through the collective unconscious faster than rational market analysis. Entire populations simultaneously decide to buy or sell based on feelings and instincts emerging from nowhere and everywhere. Social media made the collective unconscious visible in real time. Viral trends, hashtag movements, and online mob behaviors demonstrate how ideas and emotions spread through millions of minds within hours, creating coordinated patterns that no individual planned or controlled. 2016, election, Brexit, GameStop phenomenon, social justice movements. These weren't just political or economic events. They were archetypal energies moving through the collective unconscious, creating mass behaviors defying expert predictions and rational analysis. But the collective unconscious doesn't just influence major events. It shapes daily life in ways you never recognize. Tastes, preferences, fears, and desires are constantly influenced by psychological currents flowing through invisible networks of collective consciousness. Why do certain songs become global hits? Why do fashion trends sweep continents simultaneously? Why do you suddenly find yourself interested in topics emerging from nowhere? The answer lies in the collective unconscious, archetypal energies moving through human consciousness like weather systems. The advertising industry developed sophisticated techniques for tapping collective unconscious currents. Market researchers study psychological archetypes driving mass behavior, creating campaigns, activating collective unconscious responses. Political movements tap into collective currents of fear, hope, anger, and desire already moving through populations. They become vessels for archetypal energies, seeking expression through the collective psyche. The internet amplified the collective unconscious influence exponentially. Algorithm-driven curation doesn't just respond to individual preferences. It identifies and reinforces collective unconscious patterns, creating echo chambers, synchronizing thinking across millions of minds. Most disturbing, this undermines individual autonomy while creating a choice illusion. You believe you're thinking your thoughts, feeling your feelings, making your decisions. But many mental and emotional processes are expressions of collective psychological patterns you're unconsciously channeling. We now examine one of the most intimate yet deceptive aspects of psychological control. The mask you wear so consistently, you've forgotten it's not your true face. Jung called this the persona, the social mask we construct to navigate the world and gain acceptance. At first glance, the persona seems like a conscious choice. But the deeper truth is disturbing. For most people, the persona becomes a prison. They build so skillfully, they lose the key to authentic identity. Consider your professional mask, the tone you adopt in meetings, personality traits you emphasize or suppress, values you express or hide. Over time, this professional persona becomes so automatic that you forget you're performing. You mistake the role for reality, but you have different masks for family, friends, social media, and countless micro-personas for every social context. Each mask is calibrated to meet expectations and gain approval. Each filters out aspects of the authentic self that might be rejected. The digital age turned persona construction into an obsession. Social media platforms are persona management systems, allowing carefully crafted self-versions. Instagram emphasizes visual perfection. LinkedIn emphasizes professional achievement. Facebook emphasizes social connection. But here's where control becomes insidious. You begin living for the persona rather than through it. You make life choices based not on what authentically serves growth and happiness, but on what enhances your curated image. You buy things to photograph them, attend events to post about them, develop opinions to express them. The persona begins dictating reality rather than representing it. This creates a profound psychological split. Your authentic self, with messy emotions, contradictory desires, complex inner life, becomes increasingly alienated from the polished mask. You lose touch with genuine feelings, authentic preferences, and real values because you've spent energy maintaining artificial ones. Most tragic, persona possession corrupts relationships. You connect persona to persona rather than person to person. Friendships and romantic relationships become performances designed to maintain acceptance, rather than spaces for authentic intimacy. Professional environments systematically encourage persona possession through corporate culture, rewarding conformity and punishing authenticity. Educational systems teach students to perform success rather than pursue genuine learning. Consumer economy depends on persona-driven psychology. Products aren't sold on intrinsic value, they're sold as identity accessories enhancing persona. You don't buy clothes to stay warm, you buy them to communicate status. Breaking free requires courage to disappoint others, strength to tolerate social rejection, and wisdom to value authentic self-expression over external approval. We encounter perhaps the most powerful primitive force shaping human behavior: fear. Not just any fear, but the weaponization of primal terror by those who understand how to hijack ancient survival mechanisms buried in the unconscious mind. Fear is the master key unlocking every other psychological control mechanism. When fear dominates consciousness, shadow takes control, archetypal patterns become rigid, authority figures gain power, collective unconscious currents intensify, and personas become desperate for social protection. Throughout history, those seeking population control understood this fundamental truth. A frightened mind is a controllable mind. Fear bypasses rational thought, activates primitive survival instincts, and makes people willing to surrender freedom for safety promises. Modern media systems turned fear generation into precision science. News organizations don't just report events, they select and frame information to activate specific fear responses, keeping audiences psychologically engaged and politically compliant. Health scares, economic threats, environmental disasters, social upheaval, technological dangers. The media landscape keeps you in constant low-level anxiety about threats, feeling immediate and personal, but remaining outside direct control. This chronic fear state makes you more susceptible to authority-based solutions and less capable of independent critical thinking. Advertising weaponized fear through negative marketing, creating anxiety about social rejection, professional failure, health risks, lifestyle inadequacy, then offering products as solutions to fears they deliberately created. Political systems perfected fear-based manipulation through enemy archetype cultivation. Political success often depends not on inspiring hope, but on activating fear of opposition. Voters are motivated less by a positive vision than terror of what happens if the other side wins. Social media algorithms discovered fear-based content generates more engagement, creating information ecosystems systematically amplifying anxiety, outrage, and existential dread. Platforms claiming to connect actually isolate within curated fear bubbles, making independent thought increasingly difficult. Most insidious, fear-based control corrupts the relationship with reality itself. When fear dominates consciousness, you lose the capacity to accurately assess actual risks versus imagined threats. You become hypersensitive to information confirming fears while dismissing evidence providing reassurance. Fear-based propaganda hijacks specific archetypal patterns. In the collective unconscious, fear of invasion activates tribal defense mechanisms. Fear of contamination triggers disgust responses. Fear of social exclusion exploits fundamental belonging needs. These aren't rational responses to contemporary challenges. They're primitive psychological programs, adaptive in ancient environments, but maladaptive when artificially triggered by modern propaganda. Breaking free requires learning to distinguish between legitimate concerns, deserving attention, and artificially induced anxieties, serving the interests of those profiting from psychological vulnerability. We arrive at perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about human psychology, a dark secret buried so deep that most people deny its existence even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. Jung discovered the human psyche contains not just drives toward freedom and autonomy, but equally powerful drives toward submission and control. This isn't a pathological aberration, it's fundamental human nature influencing everyone, though most remain unconscious of its operation. The drive for power manifests not just as a desire to control others, but as a compulsive need to avoid personal responsibility through autonomy surrender to external authorities. Paradoxically, the ultimate expression of power over your life is often surrendering that power to someone promising to make difficult decisions for you. This explains why people voluntarily enter abusive relationships, join authoritarian movements, follow charismatic leaders into destructive situations, and submit to institutional control even when contradicting their interests. The controller-controlled relationship isn't just imposed from above. It's actively sought and maintained by both parties. Consider cult psychology. People don't join because they're kidnapped or coerced. They join because cults offer what the conscious mind desperately needs: relief from not having to make complex decisions about meaning, purpose, relationships, and values. Followers actively surrender power because autonomy feels more frightening than submission. This dynamic operates throughout society. Employees complaining about micromanaging often unconsciously seek controlling supervisors because taking full professional responsibility feels more threatening than having someone else decide. People criticizing government overreach vote for politicians, promising to solve problems they could address through personal initiative. Consumer economy depends entirely on unconscious submission drive. Marketing doesn't just create product desire, it creates desire for relief from not having to think independently about complex lifestyle decisions. Brands promise to solve identity confusion, social belonging, and personal meaning through consumption, allowing people to surrender authentic self-development work to external authorities. Social media weaponized submission drive through algorithmic curation, promising to solve overwhelming information complexity. People surrender intellectual autonomy to algorithms, promising to show what they need to see, tell them what to think, and connect them with people they should know. Most disturbing, submission drive masquerades as virtue. People surrendering autonomy often feel morally superior to those insisting on independent thinking. Submission gets reframed as humility, responsibility, and wisdom. Independent thinking gets reframed as arrogance, selfishness, and ignorance. This creates a psychological environment where autonomy becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Jung believed genuine psychological development required recognizing and integrating both power and submission drives rather than being unconsciously controlled by either. We've journeyed through the shadow landscape of human psychology, exploring 7 dark forces operating beneath consciousness, pulling behavioral strings in ways most never recognize. The shadow controls through everything you refuse to acknowledge, projecting denied darkness onto others. Archetypes script your life through ancient patterns, feeling like personal preference, but actually being collective programming. Authority structures are controlled by constructing choice frameworks themselves. The collective unconscious influences through invisible psychological currents, creating mass behaviors while maintaining individual decision illusions. P-personas imprisons within carefully constructed social masks, becoming more real than the authentic self. Fear-based propaganda hijacks primitive survival mechanisms, making you willing to surrender freedom for safety from largely imaginary threats. Your unconscious drives for power and submission make you an active participant in psychological control systems you consciously oppose. These forces work together as integrated psychological control systems, more sophisticated than any external oppression. The most perfect prison is one you build yourself, with locks you cannot see, serving jailers you never recognize. But here's Jung's profound insight. Awareness of these mechanisms is liberation's beginning. You cannot be controlled by forces you clearly understand. You cannot be manipulated by techniques you recognize. You cannot be imprisoned by systems you can see. The journey from unconscious psychological slavery to conscious psychological freedom requires courage to confront aspects of yourself and society you'd prefer ignoring. It demands strength to think independently when independent thought is socially discouraged. It necessitates wisdom to distinguish between legitimate authority and psychological manipulation. Most importantly, it requires accepting full responsibility for your psychological development, rather than surrendering that responsibility to external systems promising to think, choose, and grow for you. This doesn't mean becoming paranoid or isolated. It means becoming psychologically sophisticated enough to engage with social systems consciously, rather than being unconsciously possessed by them. The goal isn't eliminating all social influence. That's impossible. The goal is to transform your relationship with psychological influence from unconscious reaction to conscious choice. When you can see the strings, you can decide whether to dance or cut yourself free. Jung believed this psychological awakening wasn't just personally beneficial, it was essential for human civilization's survival. Societies of psychologically unconscious individuals inevitably become destructive. Only communities of genuinely aware people can create systems serving human flourishing rather than control. But the choice is ultimately individual. You can continue living as an unconscious puppet, dancing to strings you never see, serving masters you never recognize, following scripts you never chose. Most make this choice because unconscious slavery feels safer than conscious freedom, or you can begin the difficult but liberating work of psychological awakening, learning to see forces shaping behavior, developing strength to resist manipulation, cultivating wisdom to make choices based on authentic values rather than unconscious compulsions. The question isn't whether you're influenced by these forces, everyone is. The question isn't whether you've been manipulated, everyone has. The question is whether you'll remain asleep to these influences or awaken to see the strings and learn to dance by choice rather than compulsion. The strings controlling your behavior are still there. They always will be, but now you can see them. And in seeing them, you've taken the first step toward genuine psychological freedom. The choice is entirely yours. But remember, once you see the strings, you cannot unsee them. Once you recognize psychological forces shaping human behavior, you cannot return to comfortable unconscious ignorance. You stand at the threshold between two ways of being human, the unconscious way most choose, where psychological forces operate in darkness, and the conscious way few dare to attempt, where these forces become visible and manageable. Which will you choose? That answer will determine not just your individual life course, but your contribution to our species' psychological evolution. The awakening begins now. If you dare to see what's always been there, hidden in plain sight, pulling human behavior strings while remaining invisible to most awareness. The question isn't whether you are controlled. The question is whether you will remain asleep or wake up to see the strings.